Great. So this is a presentation that is work done by myself and Elizabeth Stevens at the University of Reading. And we are from a kind of hydrology, meteorology background. And then we've also got Sarah DeWitt from the University of Oxford, who's coming from a social science background. And Sarah is hopefully on the session this morning to answer any of your technical social science questions. But it's really good, I think, to have both disciplines together in the project. So hopefully that will be beneficial. So what we're talking about today is what can be learned from post-event reviews of forecast-based action. This work's still in its initial stages. We're still collecting lots of evidence and thoughts together, so it probably will raise more questions than it answers this presentation. But I wanted to share it with you today because I think it covers some of the questions that have been raised through the HIWeather seminars that have been on for the last few weeks about how we collect data after event reviews and what kind of as Brian was saying, what kind of boxes do we need to have in our collection of end-to-end case studies? So give you a quick content. So I'm talking a little bit about forecast-based financing. So I've got a quick introduction to what that is for those of you who aren't familiar with it. Talking about some after an event, and then drawing some conclusions, importantly, on what we can learn after we've had big, high-impact weather events, and quite importantly as well, what we can't. So to start with, what is forecast-based financing or action? These terms are often used interchangeably. Officially, financing is kind of the release of cash funds based on a forecast before an event happens. So this will help the humanitarian actors to set up and deliver aid and self-support for communities before things happen, rather than having to rush to the aid after an event. But then I'm also talking about forecast-based action and thinking about the presentation Rebecca already gave this morning. So this is kind of delivered through the same framework, but probably doesn't involve the financing aspect. So I've stolen these diagrams from the German Red Cross forecast-based financing website, which is a really good place to start if anyone doesn't know much about forecast-based financing. But if you want to set up these kind of models, then this is kind of the value chain that they're going through. So they start off with trying to understand what the risk scenarios are. So looking at historical events and trying to identify who's vulnerable and what the level of vulnerability is. Then looking at the available forecasts. And there's a bit of a balance here to meet between kind of international forecasts. So at the University of Reading, we use GLOFASS quite a lot. So these kind of global forecasting models, and also making the best use of in-country forecasting ability as well. So trying to review what model works best at the type of lead times that's needed to take action. So it might be that some of these actions need a week in advance. So you need to have a forecast model that can forecast your event with reasonable clarity that far in advance, or some of them might be accepting of a shorter lead times. Looking at the danger levels, the trigger at which something might happen, and then creating a standard operating procedure. So the idea with forecast-based financing is it's automatic. So once you've gone through this process and set up the system, if you meet those triggers, then the action will be triggered. And then the final stage, which isn't on here, which is very important, is evaluating. So every time an event happens, there is a formal requirement to evaluate that. And that's what I want to talk a little bit more about today. So the Red Cross have got this great website available called What Can Go Wrong with Forecast-Based Financing. And I think it's not the case that more things can go wrong with forecast-based financing than any other kind of forecasting model, but just that it's a new system. So these pilot projects have only been operational for the last 5 years or so. So people are either very keen to jump on the success of the project and go, oh, this is amazing, we need to have these kind of models for every kind of possible hazard in every area of the country, or they also might jump on it and go, oh, that just didn't work, we can't use this for anything. So trying to be aware of that's important. So you might act in vain, and by this they mean that taking action based on a forecast and then the event never actually happens. As we all know from using probabilistic forecasts, that doesn't necessarily mean our model was wrong, but how that's perceived by community and humanitarian actors is interesting. More significantly, perhaps, is an event that was unforecast. So not taking action because nothing triggered up in the model. Taking action, but perhaps along the wrong priorities. So this would happen if you didn't really understand what the impacts of the event might be. You might take some action which really, once the event happens, doesn't have any effect, no benefits to the local communities. And then the final point here is that the system itself is just too complicated. Your forecast might be great, it might have picked up the event, but actually no one could take action on it because they didn't understand the process, or it took too long to communicate this through the chain somewhere. So this is kind of the starting point for our review work, to understand what can go wrong, but the converse of this is also what can go right. So as I said before, there is a requirement after an event to do some form of trigger review. These vary in quality and success based on who's doing them and the competency of the people carrying them out, how much time and effort's put into those. And there's some examples of how to do it, and there's a couple of documents there, the Practitioner's Manual, and then the new Impact-Based Forecasting for Early Action Guide. Both of those has got examples of post-event reviews in there. But our argument is that this quite a lot of information is quite fragmented, and really more guidance needs to be provided on how to evaluate the different components after an activation. So there's a lot of literature out there saying, well, we really need to do this, but thinking more about how you actually do it, and it's quite a complex process. So I can understand why there's quite a fragmented literature on it at the minute. So the key question here for us, and I think possibly for the value chain project as well, is how do you define success? How do we say whether our forecast was successful or not? If you look in the kind of academic literature on this, most of the papers go back to the review by Murphy in 1993, which talks about a successful forecast being consistent, having quality and value. So the way we're kind of interpreting that is, was the forecast actionable and relevant? So this might have a really, really good forecast that's, you know, of high scientific accuracy, but if it's not actionable, people can't take action on it at the right lead times with the right confidence, then is it really a successful forecast? And as I said before, probabilistic based forecasts, we do expect to act in events some of the time. We're not expecting to pick up every single event, and we are expecting to probably miss some events as well. So another really important question is, who defines success? So a successful forecast from kind of a scientific forecast perspective might be very different from the operational decision makers, the humanitarian actors, or indeed the communities at the end of the chain. So who should be involved in the evaluation of success, and who should decide what the criteria is? And this is one of the questions that we're still pondering, you know, how to incorporate this into the reviews. Another critical one is, what data do we need to evidence success? So as I say, these forecast-based financing pilot models have been set up now for 5 years or more. They've triggered a number of times in different countries for different hazards. So these are kind of some of the real questions that are asked after an event. So should we change the impact level if the impacts were different to forecasts? So as I said, we have to, when we set up the model, we have to set a trigger point. Should we change the probability thresholds if we acted in vain or we didn't trigger? And then linked to that, maybe perhaps should we change the whole forecast model? Perhaps we've had an event where a different forecast model, not the one that's included in operating procedures, picked up an event and the one we're using didn't. Should we just change to another model? And should we change things we're triggering too frequently? So these kind of systems, the idea is they would trigger kind of once every 5 years or so. So if you end up with lots of triggers, is that because the thresholds are set wrong, or is it just because of that's the climate at the minute? So what I've got here is a few cases to start to explore some of our thinking on these questions. So starting with this case study in Uganda. So Uganda had one of the very first forecast-based financing pilot projects set up in 2015. And then the emergency action protocol, which is kind of the guidelines for when there would be an activation, was updated in 2020 in August, and that's currently under review. So the University of Reading has been very active working with the Ugandan Red Cross and Ugandan Ministry of Water to assess the model's skill. So these are some plots that Andrea has produced working with the Ugandan Ministry of Water and Environment, and you can see for a number of different gauges around the country it's assessed the model skill, so how reliable, what the false alarm ratio is at different trigger probabilities and based on the timelines for the action that we wish to take. You can see some of these perform well, some of these perform quite poorly. And in Uganda, there's lots of different types of river systems, and we're using GLOFAS, as I said before, and GLOFAS is a kind of international forecasting model to pick up some of the issues in the catchments. So it raises questions here about how we represent process in models. So back in May, there was a lot of flooding in Uganda along the Nile from Lake Victoria. And if you look in detail, you might say, well, GLOFAS did start to pick something up a little bit, but didn't necessarily get all the details of this event right. And if you look in detail about what happened during that event and why the model might not have represented the processes very well, it's because it was flooding along a lake, and also human management, a large amount of release of water from the lake. So the gut reaction might have been, oh no, our model didn't pick this up, and we need to look in a bit more detail about the physical reasons why that might have been. Next case study I've got is Bangladesh. Bangladesh is often seen as a success story of forecast-based financing. Pilot project was set up in 2015, a number of examples of activation, most recently in 2020. So you can see here that working in partnership with the international forecasting model, so GLOFAS, and then the in-country forecasting model, they were able to activate 10 days ahead of predicted flood for monsoon floods over the summer. So great, this looks really good. Seems like a great success story. But actually, if you look at some review here, you can see that the number of times that the model has crossed the threshold in recent years is quite frequent, and questions have started to be asked, you know, are the thresholds too low? Should we really be triggering this many times? And then moving away a bit from floods, so outside my area of expertise, but just to highlight that forecast-based financing isn't just for hydrometeorological hazards. So Mongolian zoods are extreme winter conditions which combine natural and social economic issues. So when there's a hot, dry summer, it actually reduces pasture availability, and therefore if there's a subsequent cold winter, there can be a lot of impacts because of harsh lack of fodder for food and kind of malnutrition across the community. So they've produced these kind of risk maps. I don't know what that says, but you can see it's a general kind of maps we'd see for this type of scenarios, where we've got different areas of the country highlighted with different vulnerabilities and different risks. So again, forecast-based financing triggered for an event here in 2017 and 18. And on the surface, it seems quite successful. Cash was provided for transfer of animal kits. However, how do we understand impacts on these kind of events? These food events can last periods of time. So we're not talking about a rainfall event that's over in a week and we can start to gather data. This is kind of a year long or more type event. You don't necessarily know what the forecast hazard was. Was it the extreme cold, the amounts of snow? We're talking national forecasts here, but with local impacts. So, you know, individual communities would react differently based on the resources they've got available. And impact data that's available isn't only related to weather. So trying to understand the impacts of these kind of events raises some challenges. And then for those of you who were in the earlier session this morning, Rebecca also talked through the forecast that the University of Reading alongside the University of Bristol and ECNWF produced for cyclones Idai and Kenneth in Mozambique. Got an example of the forecast products here that we produced, and there's a journal paper there if you want to read more detail. But this is a great case study because we did some work about how to establish the usefulness of the forecasts. So again, when you first read through this, it looks really great. This is the first time we've been able to use science so early in planning responding to cyclones. Great overview of the rivers which are risk. So, you know, all of this high level information looks really good. But actually, when you drill down to it, it's really hard to understand exactly how useful those forecasts have been. So we held a post-event review workshop in Mozambique a few months after the event. So I think this is quite good. It's still quite fresh in people's minds. And then Sarah's also conducted a few reports, interviews, conversations to kind of gather data about this event. And I think one of the key things is to understand here is that forecasts produced are not used in isolation. They're used alongside other products. So trying to attribute value to any one particular forecast or value chain or modelling approach is quite difficult. So I think this quote here sums it up from the German Red Cross, saying, I'm fairly sure they assisted in the overview, but I don't know, you know, you can't say for sure exactly the value of individual products. So that makes it quite difficult to establish usefulness. So our initial thinking really then on what we can learn from post-event reviews, and it's important that we do learn something, and it's important that we share the success stories. So we can learn something about how the model represents reality. Were we able to pick up particular events, or were there some kind of physical reasons why the model didn't work for particular scenarios, and understanding those can help us understand how well the model will work in the future. We can understand about whether the forecast was actionable. As I just said, it's hard to tease out this information, but it's certainly something that with a bit more experience and thought and effort, we should be able to understand whether the forecasts were actionable for particular events. And we should be able to understand, if we can get the right impact data, something about the vulnerability to the hazard. So, what happened when the flood water reached a certain threshold, and that can then feed back into our models. But what we can't draw conclusions on really is the overall suitability of the forecast model. So just because the ECMWF forecast and GLOFAST picked up one particular event doesn't mean it will pick up all particular events, and in vice versa, if it didn't pick up one particular event, that doesn't mean we should immediately switch to a different model. Because before these forecast-based finance systems are set up, there is quite a detailed model review looking at making sure that the most suitable model is picked. So we can use case studies and event-based reviews as a body of evidence, but on their own, from one view, we shouldn't really be jumping to conclusions about the suitability of the model. And similarly about the probability of occurrence, I'm sure we can say that just because we have 3 or 4 big events within a 10-year period doesn't necessarily mean that the probabilities are wrong in the model. We need a much longer data set to say something about that. So that was kind of a whistle-stop run through where we are with this at the minute. So kind of drawing some quick conclusions on that. There's a growing body of literature monitoring and evaluation of forecast-based financing. Our opinion of that is it's quite fragmented, and particularly for the kind of humanitarian actions, there needs to be some much more clear guidance about the type of data they should be collecting after events and the type of questions that we can answer. But to do that comes along with its own challenges. How do we define success? How do we establish the use and usefulness of forecasts? And how can we collect data on impacts? So as I said right at the beginning, I wanted to present this today because I think it ties in with the work that the value chain project's starting to set up in terms of how do you build a case studies of end-to-end events. So if anyone's interested, we've got a session next week at the Global Dialogue platform, which is titled "What Can We Learn About Forecast Triggers from Just the Activation?" Trying to avoid death by PowerPoint. So this will be kind of an interactive debate, and we've got different people from the humanitarian community debating different opinions. So please come along to that. I think it'll be quite interesting. We're going through the process of collecting case studies and speaking to experts. And our idea is to produce a short output guidance for humanitarians about the type of things they can learn and how they should go about documenting that. And then probably there'll be some kind of academic review paper as well. So that's all I've got to say. I hope that was interesting to everybody. And any questions, I'm happy to answer them.